ABC Thursdays.
Welcome back.
Grey's Anatomy is all new.
Why didn't you tell me you were pregnant?
The drama going down
Bungee jumping from the bridge, his cord snapped.
We need all hands on deck.
is unbelievable.
You think you're God's gift to this hospital? You're just another doctor.
My relationship with Catherine is complicated.
I'm gonna sue you.
Your lawyers know where to find me.
You're unbelievable.
Grey's Anatomy. All new Thursdays, 10/9 Central on ABC and stream on Hulu.
911, what's your emergency?
Oh my God. Please.
You said bees?
ABC Thursdays, 911 is all new.
That truck was hauling 22 million killer bees.
With the 3-part season premiere of that,
That's enough bees to kill
44,000 people.
Is that some bee NATO?
this one's gonna sting.
Help is coming!
911, all new Thursdays, 8/7 Central on ABC and stream on Hulu.
Well, hello again, listeners, and you're listening to Girls, Guts, and Giallo. You're about to hear an interview I did with the director of the 1995 film about bloodthirsty leather dykes, BloodSisters. The director is Michelle Handelman. You get about the first 43 minutes of this interview for free. I know, I'm so generous. But if you want to hear the whole interview, you're going to have to head on over to my Patreon at patreon.com/girlsgutsgiallo. And you're going to want to hear the whole thing because it's juicy. So again, if you want to hear my whole interview with Michelle Handelman, director of BloodSisters, head on over to patreon.com/girlsgutsgiallo. Enjoy the show.
You must tell me all your secrets. Remember, we must share everything together. Everything.
Listeners, this is Annie Rose Malamet, and you're listening to Girls, Guts, and Giallo. Very special episode today. I'm extremely excited because I am talking to Michelle Handelman, the director who I'm a huge fan of, who's also a multimedia artist, uses video, live performance, and photography to make confrontational works that explore the sublime in its various forms of excess and nothingness. That was from your website, Michelle, and I loved that, so I wanted to include that in your bio. Thank you so much for joining me today, Michelle.
Thank you for having me, Annie. It's great to be here.
So, Michelle, you have recent projects. Your recent projects include Delirium, which is a collaboration with Lydia Lunch, who I'm a huge fan of, the film Hustlers and Empires, These Unruly and Ungovernable Selves, and Doom Scrolling, which is an integrated video performance with Shannon Funches, which sounds amazing. And in the 1990s, you collaborated with the prolific industrial artist Monty Kazaza, who I'm a huge fan of. So I also know you from those collaborations. But listeners will probably be most familiar with your seminal documentary on leather dyke subculture, BloodSisters, from 1995, which we'll be talking about today. A celebration of dykes deep into sadomasochism, bondage, blood, and leather. BloodSisters is an essential text for leather dykes everywhere and is often many queer people's first introduction to the subculture. And when I first saw it, it simply blew my mind wide open. And it is playing at the Roxy Theater here in San Francisco on September 28th. And Michelle, you were saying that it first premiered at the Roxy when it showed.
Well, I wasn't the actual first premiere was with the Frameline Film Festival, which was in June of '95. And for that screening, it premiered, I think it was the Victoria Theater. I'm not sure if that's still there. It wasn't that far away from the Roxy, actually. But that was kind of a beautiful disaster because it was It was literally finished like moments before the screening, essentially.
Oh, wow.
And it was probably 90 minutes in length, a lot longer than what the final cut ended up being. And so I think the film festival was really pissed at me because it was a lot longer than they were expecting. There were people standing in line waiting for my film to end for the next screening to come in. And it was this incredible event because the theater was packed. I mean, I think there were like 500 people there or something. I'd never experienced anything like that before, but it was also very, what's the right word? It was very humbling, I guess is the right word to use in the situation, because I realized as I was watching that, oh my God, I need to cut more. Like, this is still just a rough cut, even though I made it for the Frameline premiere. So when we finally trimmed a lot more out of it, I think the next San Francisco premiere was at the Roxy. And I think it wasn't that long after, because I've been going through my archive right now and particularly putting together the BloodSisters archive, which is just so incredible. And I could see that we had a screening in the Roxy, at the Roxy that year. So it's really exciting that it's going to be back there. And I wish I could be there. I love the Roxy.
I know. I wish you could be there too.
Yeah. And I love my years in San Francisco. That time was, I believe it was a really special time in San Francisco in particular. And I think that's part of the reason why the film is really speaking to people again, 25 years later.
Yeah, and particularly speaking to Leatherdykes and the Leatherdyke culture that still exists here in San Francisco. I mean, I'm in a Leatherdyke group chat, and when I told them that I was going to talk to you, and I was like, do you have any questions for Michelle Handelman? It was, you're a celebrity, to the Leatherdykes here. So what about those years do you feel like was so special in particular?
Well, I think what was happening not only in the Leatherdyke scene, but, particularly in the fetish world and the leather world, both men, women, and as B.C. Cliver says, everyone in between, that was really starting to just expand at that moment in time, because the film came out in 95 and I probably started shooting in 93. And I think the International Miss Leather Contest, either in 92 or 93, I don't remember, was the first thing I shot. And it became very apparent at that moment in time that there were so many people who were expanding their identities and expanding their relationship to gender along with sexuality. And there were so many trans people at that moment in time in San Francisco that were really not even part of a community at that point in time. I mean, certainly not like there's a trans community now. And I think a lot of those people were very much a part of the S&M scene, because, as I think people still know, what's now called the BDSM fetish scene is one of the most welcoming groups of people I've ever encountered, where, anyone is welcome if they want to explore something that is not accepted somewhere else. And so it was apparent in San Francisco at that moment that obviously, the expansion of gender identity, of course, the growth of the piercing scene and the tattoo community, all of that stuff was, just on fire in San Francisco in the early 90s, and was starting to spread out into other places. But I feel like San Francisco was really the epicenter for that at that moment in time. And that made it unique because it's for anyone who lives in San Francisco, you probably know it's kind of off the charts. And I don't mean off the charts like it's out of control. I mean, it's a quiet place, San Francisco. Like the rest of the country doesn't really care about San Francisco or what's going on there culturally. That was always my experience there, and that was part of the reason why I went there. You know, there's this great freedom and being in a place that nurtures obscurity. And of course, San Francisco is a much different place now with, you know, the tech explosion. But at that moment in time, there was still this feeling of a beautiful obscurity that you could do whatever the fuck you wanted, and no one was going to bother you about it.
Yeah, that's such, I mean, it sounds like halcyon days now compared to like the big tech boom that's taken over, but there really is still that core here. And there is, you know, when I have friends visit and they see driving over the bridge and there's the leather district and the big leather pride flag, you know, that's so special. You know, what other city has this huge leather pride flag flying over? And it really is kind of there still is such a beautiful leather history and scene here that's thriving, and it's part of why I moved here and part of why I love it here. And there's always been, you know, I was just rereading my copy of Leatherfolk, and there's an essay by Gail Rubin where she's talking about gay men's SM culture here and how that was thriving in the 70s, and basically the formation of the Society of Janus, and how fags kind of taught dykes how to party, taught SM dykes how to party. And, you know, I'm thinking about that kind of leading into the 90s and then kind of being exposed in your film. And I'm thinking about International Miss Leather, and I know that you were inspired to make BloodSisters after attending International Miss Leather with your friends Skeeter and Jamie. And I think Skeeter is going to be at the screening at the Roxy, and I've met Skeeter before, and they both appear in the film. And what did you see there that was so inspiring to you? It must have been quite a weekend.
Well, first of all, it's so great that Skeeter is going to be at the screening, and I hope she hears this. Skeeter just laughs at me. You know, there was a DVD release when Kino Lorber re-released BloodSisters, and they put out a DVD, and there's a lot of extras on the DVD. So I highly recommend it if people are into it. There's a whole bunch of outtakes and commentary. And so me, Skeeter, and Queen Cougar did a voiceover commentary throughout the whole film. And one of the things Skeeter kept reminding me of was when I first talked to her about making this film and, you know, asking her to introduce me to some people, that she thought that she would help introduce me to people, but she had never imagined that she would be featured in the film as much as she is. You know, she's kind of like the guide throughout the entire film. And she just laughs about it now because she was saying how she was kind of horrified. If she knew that was going to happen, she probably wouldn't have been so helpful to begin with. But of course, Skeeter's just so irresistible. How could
she's like an icon?
I know. How could we not have her on screen? You're riveted listening to Skeeter.
Oh, absolutely.
The entire time. So what did I see there? What I saw was this incredible marriage between sexuality and political activism. And that was not something I was expecting. You know, Skeeter and Jamie were choreographing stuff. They had been doing that and putting on events for a while at that point in time. And I met Skeeter and Jamie through another mutual friend named Scott Chatsky, who was one of the piercers at the Gauntlet. And they invited me to go to International Miss Leather. And I thought it would be a great, wild, sexy night, which it was. But I was not ready for this mix of intense hardcore intellectual political rally that was going on there. And I very quickly saw that part of what was going on, and this goes back to what you're talking about with Gail. So Gail, who, we all know is a great historian of the leather community in San Francisco and also, throughout the country, really. And Gail was there observing the men because, like any other place in our country, it's a patriarchy. And so it's the males communities that always have the access. And women, have to somehow build their own or get access through the male guardians. So that's what Gail was talking about. And then flash forward to the 90s, when you have so many men in the community dying from AIDS. Much more, of course, women get AIDS too, but, at that point in time, it was primarily a disease affecting men. And you had all of these women who were part of the leather scene, and part of the fundraising that they were doing was to help take care of people who were dying from AIDS who didn't have access to health care for all of the reasons that we know about. And that, of course, wasn't the only thing they were fundraising for. There was women's health issues too, and trans health issues. But everything, every speech, every dance, every performance was tied to some political cause. And all of the monies were going as donations to help support these causes. And that, I just thought that was so smart. Like, wow, here are these incredible women who are so powerful and so smart, and they have found a way to get their rocks off and pleasure themselves and each other and raise money for people in need at the same time. So that was it.
Yeah, that's part of what I love so much about the community. And is this something where you became involved in the leather community yourself through making the film?
I've always been involved in S&M play and various relationships within my life, but I'm one of these people who's always on the outside of any community I'm a part of. I'm always on the perimeter in some way because I'm like a lone wolf traveling in a lot of different communities. So I wouldn't say I was like a member of the community. I was certainly, while making this film, observing people who were part of the community, who were making the community, who were active. But I was still there. I was active. I was shouting. I was playing. I wasn't trying to present an outsider's point of view. And I wasn't really an outsider, but I wasn't a complete insider either.
I feel like that comes through in the film. I feel like it's definitely not a film made by an outsider. Like, you can tell that there's a real personal investment in the film, but there's also enough distance where there's still a kind of objective view of it. I feel like that really, what you're saying really comes through in the film. That makes sense. So BloodSisters is obviously very rooted in this kind of feminist, very political punk aesthetic of the 90s, but the film is also heavily influenced by exploitation and sexploitation aesthetics. And to that point, who were some of your influences in that vein when you made the film?
Well, I think one of the best exploitation films. Well, there's so many good ones, and so many I have seen that I can see the posters, and I don't even remember the movies at all. I mean, like, look at all of Doris Wishman's films. And I think Doris Wishman's films and the crazy Dutch angles that she uses in her films and these
Yes.
roving cameras. That was a big inspiration to me. The way she lingers on bodies and has this combination of eroticism and violence, of course, which is, of course, part of S&M play to begin with. But that is something that always attracted me to her films, because I think they were very much rooted in kind of in a sadomasochistic worship. But Doris would never admit to that.
Right.
But my favorite is probably the first 20 minutes of Faster Pussycat Kill Kill, Russ Meyer. Those first 20 minutes are just film perfection in my mind. From the opening scene, first you have like just this graphic of like a vocal cord and a sound wave, where you have this heavy masculine voice going, the thrills, the chills, and hear the babies. And then it cuts to this close up of this go-go dancer right in on her crotch, and she's gyrating. And then we get to the cars. I mean, I won't explain all of Faster Pussycat Kill Kill, but those first 20 minutes, up until they kill the guy at the racetrack, and then, they go off. Up until that point is just cinematic genius in terms of its relationship to using a female body as this representation of landscape, of freedom, of California. It's such a California film. And I would have to say that was probably in my mind a lot while I was making the film. There's another exploitation film called Man Eaters on Motorbikes.
Ooh, I haven't heard of that one.
And yeah, that was a real, grade D movie that had this great theme song. It was the Man Eaters on Motorbikes, and they're all this is about a female bike club, and they go around destroying people. And that was in my mind a lot, and that was very much the inspiration for the theme song to BloodSisters and the opening of having the Dykes on Bikes at the very beginning. So there's all sorts of little things within BloodSisters, that are just visual and sound gimmicks that you might find in a sexploitation film, like the whip cracks when there's some of the graphic images from S&M cartoons from the 1940s and 50s. And then I do like a page tear and a whip crack as it cuts and cuts. And they're kind of, they're kind of cheesy, and they're just kind of that exploitation genre. And I love it, So I fit in little bits of animation and little sound snaps whenever I could, because it was just so much fun to do that. And but it's so of the 90s, the aesthetic with the colors and just the lo-fi video effects that are in it, which I think is another reason why people are really attracted to it now too. People in their 20s are really attracted to it because it's so retro in that sense. Yeah, so I always felt like I really smashed a lot of influences in there.
Yeah.
But I just want to finish to your point, and I'm really grateful that you said that you can tell I had a personal investment in the film, because I did. And as I said, I was not an insider, but I certainly wasn't an outsider. It's not like I'm some straight person who was like, oh, what are these weird people doing with these piercings and tattoos? I mean, I was part of all of that. But I did structure the film. And when I made the film, I wanted it to be TV ready. I wanted it to be on PBS. I was so blown, like I said, I was so blown away by what I saw as this, eye-opening entry point into what these radical people who have been vilified are really the good that they're really doing for all of our lives, and for not only the queer community, who of course has vilified anyone who's into the fetish scene, but just for everyone. And I wanted to make a film that could go on television and open up other people's eyes. But of course, it never went on TV in the US, but it did in Europe, a few places. And I was, grateful enough within the touring around in the early days to actually have a few people come up to me at screenings who are really like straight Christians who came to the screening because, so they told me, because they were very upset, and wanted to prove themselves right in a way, to see these horrible, evil freaks on screen, and that they actually had the wherewithal and they were moved enough to come up to me after the screenings and tell me that their minds had been changed and their minds had been opened and they realized that they were wrong. And moments like that just made me feel like that was why I made this, and it just made me feel like I had done something right with my life.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible to be able to influence people like that. And it's also, there's an interesting friction here, because you were also saying that part of why you went to San Francisco is so you could be in this obscurity. And then at the same time, you're also wanting to bring this film to a larger audience. That's just a kind of an interesting almost friction to me. And I think this is something that we think about in leather community all the time is, what do we obscure? What do we show? What do we keep cloak and dagger and close to the chest? And like, how do we invite people in? And I don't know if I have a question there, but you just talking about that made me kind of think about that friction in fetish community of like inviting people in versus, kind of having to hide things to protect ourselves. And this movie, I know you probably experienced a lot of backlash at the time because of, and you've talked about this in other interviews, because of the feminist sex wars that were going on at the time. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about kind of the backlash. I know like filmmakers like Bette Gordon and Lizzie Borden were, controversial among feminists at the time for kind of their neutrality around porn and sex work, and fetish and SM kind of fell under that for a lot of anti-porn feminists. So what kind of backlash did you receive from that contingent at the time?
It's interesting though that you bring up this idea of the obscurity versus the public facing. And I never really thought about it that way. So it's going to give me a lot more to think about. So thank you, Annie, for that. Yeah, what I came to realize, not that it surprised me, but nothing scares people more than S&M. It's just this, the combination of sex and violence, sex and aggression, sex and pain, that very overt combination. Of course, that all of those combinations happen all the time in everyone's sexual experiences. But the fact that in the S&M community, we vocalize about it, and this is what it's all about, actually. And people can't handle that.
No.
Most people, they just can't handle it because it brings up so many taboos. And, of course, mostly tied into religion. And of course, our whole culture is based on religious taboos. And it's nothing people have a language to talk about. They're starting to get a language to speak about it now, but back then there really wasn't a language to talk about it. It's interesting how well put you described how S&M got, lumped into the anti-porn movement, because it's not pornography, but that just opens up this whole deep dive into what is pornography and what is acceptable behavior, and who makes those rules, and who gets to say what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. And I think one of the things that really upsets so many people about BloodSisters and S&M, and in particular S&M Dykes, is part of it is this refusal of respectability politics. It's partially a big fuck you to how you think I should live my life, or what I can say in public or out loud. It's not even in some ways, it's less about the very specifics about the S&M play and more about personal freedom. And seeing some people get very upset and can't handle it when others decide they're not going to wait for someone to tell them what to do. They're going to take control and do what they want to do. And so I think a lot of the backlash I experienced came from that perspective. Well, from all of those perspectives, really. And, specific instances, every time it played, when it came out, it was 1995, and then it played for like 2-3 years. It toured around the world. And for the first 2 years in the States, pretty much every time it showed, the programmers it was always like, we're going to show this, but we're going to get in trouble for it. Or some sort of nervous laughter. We'll put it on late. Or, oh no, who's going to talk bad about us now? But we're going to do it anyway. Like, aren't we a brave film festival? We're going to show your film. But at the same time, a lot of people were showing a side of themselves that they also thought this was wrong or needed to be hidden. So there was a lot of this underhandedness that was going on, of like slapping in the face, but it was very quiet. It was still, I was always made to feel like the bad girl, the bad child, but and like I said, I think it took till now, many generations later, for the film to actually be loved. And I don't mean that as like fans just, oh, I love it. But I mean like people really caring and being able to open their eyes and see everyone in the film for who they are as people, and how brave they were at that moment in time to put themselves out on the line. Because people in their 20s now and 30s know that now. They understand that there was a history, but they never saw that history till, somehow BloodSisters sort of bubbled up to the surface again. And that was another thing that's been very moving for me, actually. A lot of young people saying, I always knew my kinky queer auntie existed, but I never saw her before till I saw BloodSisters. And so I guess there just haven't been many films since BloodSisters that really show this community, whether not necessarily San Francisco, but anywhere really in depth. So that's part of its significance right now. But there was something else I wanted to say. You were asking about the backlash. Oh, and talking about what you were saying in terms of people being private about everything. There were a lot of people who wouldn't be in Blood Sisters. Gail Rubin being one of them. I asked Gail several times if I could interview her, and she out and out refused every time, but she was very generous and allowed me to come to her house and film a lot of her archive, which appears in the film. But it wasn't an easy film to make for those reasons. It wasn't an easy film to put out there. And I think it wasn't an easy film for people to watch. And I don't just mean the naysayers, but I think for a lot of people who were part of the scene as well, when that film came out, it put a lot of people in a vulnerable position.
Yeah, it was really, it's exposing, something really vulnerable, as you said. And I mean, it's such a radical film in so many ways. I mean, there's nothing like it in so many facets of it. I mean, even the sexploitation influences that you're talking about, the way that you take them, because, a lot of people would say that those films are very much, an example of, what Laura Mulvey would call the male gaze, right? These films like Faster, Pussycat, Kill, Kill, this would very much be a classic example of that principle, right? But you're taking them and making them, we're seeing them through the eyes of dykes, right? And we're taking these kind of influences like the women in prison film even, and the reform schoolgirl films, and that use lesbianism as the point of titillation for a male audience, and you're taking them and you're making them for a queer audience. And it's very radical. It's a very radical thing. So it's not just radical in showing this community, it's radical in the formal choices that you made, and also in the way that you show the artist's hand, in your split screens and overlays. And there's just so many ways that this film is singular. I feel like I'm just waxing poetic now about the film. So something that I find really powerful about Blood Sisters is this various array of body types and different dykes that we get to see. And the Bay Area in general has always been a hotbed of fat activism. And fat activist Marilyn Wan was a longtime San Francisco resident, and she first published her zine Fatso in 1994, which just a year before the premiere of Blood Sisters. And as a fat dyke, I find that really special element of the film. And I guess I just wanted to hear more about how you selected people in the community to interview, and what was your approach to diversity of bodies and race and gender presentation?
Well, I'm naturally drawn to diversity in everything that I do. And that's part of going back to me being the lone wolf and being a part of a lot of different sort of groups. And that's just how I imbibe life, really. And so that is very intuitive. It's very much just something how I operate and have always operated. But then, of course, I can look at it as a political position in terms of trying to represent as many different types of people and bodies as possible. So, that, of course, is operating as well. But quite honestly, with picking, who's really going to be focused in Blood Sisters, it really was of that moment in time in San Francisco. And so who were the people that were out there? Like Cougar, I think, had just won international not international leather, but Miss San Francisco leather, I think. I could be wrong there, but she was a title holder. Who else? There were other title holders. Tala, whip mistress extraordinaire. Tala was everywhere. And I am obsessed with whips. So there was no way Tala wasn't going to be in the piece. And Skeeter, as I had said previously, was a friend and also worked at Mr. S. and knew everyone, and everyone loved Skeeter, and Skeeter was accessible and very easy to work with and looked great on camera and had a lot to say in terms and a great sense of humor in terms of explaining things. So Skeeter just sort of by default in a way became this storyteller throughout the film. Like she's almost like the narrator. And JC Collins, I don't know, people, I just fell in love with JC as soon as I met JC. And JC was a title holder too, I believe. And I loved JC started to show me their photographs. And JC was a big biker. And I just love a big butch biker. So it was a combination of just people I was attracted to, people who were open and wanted to meet me, people who were very present, who were the title holders at that moment in time that were doing events. There were people, like I said, there were some people I asked to be in who refused to be in it. And then, of course, there was a bunch of people who really, really wanted to be in it that I just didn't interview for various reasons. It was, it's hard because you fall in love with everyone and you want to talk to everyone and you just can't put everyone in the film. I was told when I was editing that I should cut out a few people completely just to tighten things up, but I couldn't do that. I just couldn't, so I would just cut what people had. Wiki Stamps, who shows up near the end. Like I didn't meet Wiki who was a writer. I didn't meet Wiki until the very end of making the film. And there was we just clicked right away and connected on a lot of levels. And it felt important to me to put Wiki in the film. So there's so many things at play. This is the first time I made a documentary, and it's really the only documentary I've ever made. I've worked on a few others for other people, but it's very difficult. Editing a documentary is one of the hardest things. Shooting is great fun. You just shoot everything, and you talk to everyone, and you talk for hours and hours and hours. It's fantastic. But then, you have to make the hard decisions. So part of the editing process, I think, in relationship to what you're saying, is making sure there's enough people who are different from one another that are represented in the film. But it was still, I would say it was a very integrated scene, but it was still primarily white. And, I'm sure it still is. And, I think there's a lot of issues around race, class, and representation that we all have to contend with still. That is not going away.
Yeah, absolutely. I wrote a piece about BloodSisters a few years ago, and that was something that came up in my piece was the lack of discussion about race in the film. And there's, my girlfriend is a black leather dyke here in the Bay, and it's definitely still such a white scene, and that's definitely still an issue that comes up. But they're even looking through archives at the time that you made the film. There's very little discussion of that element of race in the scene going on. There were a few things here and there, but I found very little. Even in Coming to Power, there was maybe like one or two pieces about race and SM. It was very surprising. But yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's definitely still something that we in the SM leather community still have to contend with, especially in regards to diversity in art. So you talked about in the release of BloodSisters. This is something you've talked about in other interviews, but if you would do me the favor of rehashing a little bit how your film got caught up in the culture war of the 90s, and particularly in regards to the NEA and the American Family Association. Can you tell me a little bit about that? What happened with that?
Yeah.